Well, hello to my Sunday school friends. It is really, really nice to see you. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you're happy and that your family is doing well. We talked about King Hezekiah, remember that? And we talked how King Hezekiah had died. And after King Hezekiah came King Josiah. Now, Josiah was only 8 years old when he became the king of Israel. 8. He was just a little guy, right? What is that? Second grade, third grade, right? And nobody is going to let a third grader actually be in charge of stuff. So the high priest kind of ran everything and made decisions. You know, the guy who's in charge of the temple kind of made decisions for a few years. So Josiah was the king, but he got to, ask for double desserts and such. He didn't really get to do anything until he was 16. So there were those 8 years where the high priest ran stuff and the high priest was in charge, and Josiah listened to the priests. He listened to those who taught about God and God's laws, and Josiah loved God. Josiah wanted to do what was right in God's sight. So when Josiah turned 16 and he started making the decisions himself, one of the first things he commanded was for the temple to be fixed up. The temple had fallen into terrible ruin. That people hadn't taken care of it. They hadn't kept it up. There'd been someone had built an altar to Baal, a foreign god, a false god, right in the courtyard of the temple. It was falling down and it was dirty, and Josiah said, no, we're going to fix that. And he provided money and workers, and they took out all of the foreign stuff. They took out all of the stuff to other idols. They carried it outside the city and they burned it. They fixed the building and they cleaned it up. They sent the priests back into the temple to clean up the insides of the temple. And while he was cleaning the inside of the holy place, one of the priests found an old scroll. And he didn't know what it was. So he brought it out into the sunshine and he dusted it off. It was the law of Moses. The law that God had given Moses, that Moses had written down. The law that was supposed to be read to the people every 7 years. That hadn't been read to them in hundreds of years. Right? They got away, they got lost. And the priest was so excited. And he sent it to King Josiah. And King Josiah was so excited. And he asked that this book be read to him, this scroll be read to him. And so the priest started to read to him. And it said right in there that God would bless everyone who did what God commanded, but that God would punish everyone who didn't do what they were commanded to do. And Josiah knew that his people hadn't been doing what they were supposed to do. And he was so afraid for his people, because it said right there in the book that God would punish you if you didn't do what you're supposed to do. And Josiah wept. He cried and he asked that God would forgive the people, and that he would try to help make the people into a good people, to do what God wanted them to do. He asked a prophetess, a woman who was a prophet, if God would really hurt the people because of their stupidity and their ignorance and their forgetting the things of the law. And the prophetess said that God had seen Josiah's tears and had heard the prayer that Josiah prayed for his people, and that God would forgive them for Josiah's sake. Well, Josiah called people from all over the country. He set up a big date where everyone was supposed to come and everyone would hear God's law. He made sure that people knew it. He made sure that the ordinances of the temple, the stuff that's supposed to happen in the temple, was happening on time. When he figured out that people weren't keeping the Passover anymore, he decided to have a nationwide Passover. He invited everyone to come to Jerusalem. He provided lambs and bulls out of his own herds, his own flocks, to feed the people. There was unleavened bread. There was the story of the Passover, how God had taken Israel out of captivity, out of slavery in Egypt, brought them out of across the Red Sea and out through the wilderness. God had provided for them. You know these stories. We've talked about them. How God had given them the law from Mount Carmel. How God had protected them from their enemies, had sent bread from heaven. All of that the people remembered. For 7 days they celebrated the Passover. There hadn't been a Passover that big since the days of Samuel. Remember, Samuel was the prophet that anointed David king. So a long, long time. And Josiah made sure that things happened in accordance with God's laws and God's rules, right? Now, near the end of his life, he had a moment of big dumbness, right? The king of Egypt wanted to go to war with this, I think it was the Syrians, right? And needed to pass through Israel. The king of Egypt, is that what I said? The king of Egypt wanted to go to war with the Syrians and wanted to pass through Israel on his way to make war. And Josiah didn't want him to, right? So Josiah got the army out, was going to go out and meet the king of Egypt. The king of Egypt sent him a message saying, look, your own God is with me in this. Your own God told me to do this. I don't have any fight with you. I don't want anything from you. I'm not going to take anything from Israel. We're just going to have this fight that God wants us to have, right? That you should get out of my way. You should go home. You shouldn't mess with us because God is with me in this. Instead of listening to that, Josiah decided that he was going to go fight the Egyptian army. So he dressed in common clothes, right? He pretended he wasn't the king, and he went out with some guys, and they tried to attack the Egyptian army, and the Egyptian army just swatted them aside, right? It wasn't even a contest. Josiah wasn't supposed to be there. God was with the king of Egypt in this particular case. And Josiah was hit with an arrow, and his soldiers brought him back to Jerusalem, and that's where he died. He'd been the king of Judea for 31 years, and he had helped remind people who they were and what they were supposed to do. He was dumb at the end, and he made a big mistake, but he was mourned when he died. People loved him, and they buried him with his fathers, with his ancestors. So that is the story of Josiah and the Forgotten Book. All right, I'll see you next time. You take care. Do good work. I always love hearing from you. Bye-bye.